Clouds speed overhead toward the distant horizon. The scene is framed in camera. The shutter clicks, and in that moment, the present becomes the past, and the future becomes the present, freezing the cycle of time. Borderlands is my photographic discourse on the country that straddles the 49th parallel, from the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains to the grasslands of Saskatchewan and to western North Dakota. In it, I employ the histories enacted on the land to steer a course of photographic and personal exploration toward the intersections of pasts with the present. The indigenous peoples who first inhabited this land viewed it with a spiritual reverence. I believe, as they do, in a spirit of the land, a land of melancholic beauty, an oasis of solitudes where you can feel the wind blow the dust of ages. Borderlands is a book about time as much as it is about place. Through photography and contextual narrative, it renders the land and its stories metaphorically as a river of time with tributaries of history and disparate cultures flowing in discontinuous moments of consciousness. In 1890, William James studied the perception of time and introduced the term stream of consciousness. He stated, "The knowledge of some other part of the stream, past or future, near or remote, is always mixed in our knowledge of the present thing." In my search to create photographs that elicit a connection to the past, I have journeyed with the belief that we travel in complex, interconnecting spheres of time. On numerous occasions in Borderlands, I have followed a road searching for a particular past, and, by happenstance, have crossed into another sphere leading me to unexpected discoveries. These intersections and transformations are empirically examined with an inquisitive yet respectful eye, ever mindful of the ubiquity of impermanence. In 1879, Sitting Bull and his Sioux followers lived in exile north of the border in present-day south-central Saskatchewan. Desperate for food, in July of that year, a hunting party crossed the border into Montana in search of buffalo. At Beaver Creek, they were engaged in battle with the advanced troops of the U.S. Army under General Nelson Bearcoat Miles. During the skirmish, Grasswoman, daughter of Chief Black Moon, was separated from the retreating hunting party. Missing and presumed dead, Grasswoman staggered back into camp near Wood Mountain, Saskatchewan, 12 days later. She had escaped the battle and Bearcoat's Crow and Cheyenne scouts by hiding under sagebrush and grasses until nightfall. In an heroic act of self-preservation, Grasswoman forded the Milk River in darkness and nearly drowned. She covered more than 100 miles of unmarked prairie, walking mainly at night so as not to be seen, subsisting on only the water she could find. Inspired by this little-known story of courage and the will to survive, I traveled to Grasslands National Park in southern Saskatchewan and to Rock Creek to walk the same land where this story played out. There, I experienced the transformational nature of time created by this seemingly unchanged land. In the rising mist of an autumn morning, I felt that elasticity of time and pondered the temporal quality of human endeavor in the enduring prairie landscape. I could feel trouble brewing as I stepped out of my van onto Pinto Horse Butte. A swell of heat rose from the freshly paved blacktop. Grasses gently rustled in a whisper of afternoon breeze, punctuated only by the ominous screech of hawks circling overhead. The calm before the storm, I thought. The turbulent weather system I had driven through the day before was catching up to me and was about to collide with another front. It seemed appropriate that the two systems should meet above the butte. It was here, in 1877, that Northwest Mounted Police Major James Walsh and Sitting Bull shook hands for the first time in what would prove to be a tumultuous but close relationship. I saw no plaque commemorating the site, but then why would there be one? The story of the Sioux in Canada is not one to pride ourselves on, and for that reason is relegated to a footnote in Canadian history. Straddling the border between then and now, I waded across a field of tall grass to photograph a remnant of another tale atop the butte, an old bullet-hole-riddled Ford pickup. Like a ship run aground, the maroon truck sat on a grassy shoal, awaiting the coming squall. Insulated by my thoughts of Major Walsh and the plight of the exiled Sioux, my day had become dreamlike. I seemed to be traveling in two spheres of time, of teepee rings and an old Ford pickup. While eddies of energy and time swirled around me, the scene darkened. As I hurried back to the shelter of my van, wind twisted the grass into 1,000 tiny whips about my legs. Droplets of rain began to splatter on the blacktop, causing steam to rise like smoke. In a sudden crack of thunder, the skies opened and the tempest was upon Pinto Horse Butte. Working in Hale County, Alabama, for the U.S. Farm Security Administration, Walker Evans earned renown for his portraits of poor sharecroppers and rural poverty. His artistic expression in documentary photography from the 1930s has been influential in shaping my own photographic perspective. Months before I walked into the Redeemer Church in southern Alberta, I was given a contact print made directly from an original Walker Evans negative from the collection of the Library of Congress. The photograph was entitled Church Interior, Alabama, 1936. In it, Evans' use of light and space to render a timeless quality is an example of his dedication to the idea of photography as a creative tool. As I entered this simple place of prayer, the air hung heavy like a sultry summer day in Alabama. The stale smell of dust and the fetor of splattered bird droppings wrinkled my nose. A crocheted lace altar cloth draped limply over the plywood altar. Above it, in the subdued light of worship, a warped portrait of Christ was thumbtacked to the wood-paneled wall. On the dais, an ornate Thomas pump organ, similar to the one in Evans' photograph, sat soundlessly, adorned with a bouquet of plastic chrysanthemums. The drone of flies buzzing about excitedly, banging into the sunlit windowpane, were the only hymns of praise that day. Southern Alberta and Hale County, Alabama, are far apart, but as I stood in the first row of the Redeemer Church and composed my photograph, I connected across borders of time and space. On numerous occasions, I have been told that at one time in their history, most rural structures in North Dakota were used to store grain. Such was the circumstance for the wood-framed, clapboarded building that once housed U.S. Army Major David Brotherton at Fort Buford. It was sold off in 1895, when the fort at the confluence of the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers was abandoned. Purchased by a farmer, the former officers' quarters were used for grain storage and thus survived demolition. Late one afternoon on a hot and humid day in June, I opened the door to Major Brotherton's restored headquarters at Fort Buford and stepped into an air-conditioned, climate-controlled museum and time capsule. It took me a few minutes to adjust to the unexpectedly drastic yet refreshing change before I considered the irony of the moment. Tuesday, July 19, 1881, was a dismally cold and rainy day. At noon, Sitting Bull and his band of 188 impoverished people plodded their scrawny ponies across the parade grounds at Fort Buford to the eerily discordant screech of the Red River carts that followed. Tired, hungry, and broken, Sitting Bull's 4-year self-imposed exile in Canada was over. He had come to surrender. Life had come full circle for Sitting Bull. 15 years earlier, in retaliation for the deaths of his people in the wake of the Minnesota-Dakota conflict and incursions into Dakota Territory, he led attacks against the newly constructed Fort Buford. Most notably, during the bitter cold of December 1866, the Sioux crossed the Missouri River and gained control of the ice house and sawmill on the outskirts of the fort. It has been reported that on the second day of skirmishes, while occupying the sawmill, Sitting Bull beat time on its large circular saw blade and sang loudly, taunting the soldiers. This didn't last long, though, as cannon batteries from the fort zeroed in and infantry charged the sawmill, eventually chasing the warriors back to the frozen riverbanks. There was no singing, no taunting, nor beating of drums on July 20th, 1881, when nearly 40 people crammed into the parlor of Major Brotherton's quarters to witness the great leader's surrender. Nor were there any distractions when I stood alone in that empty, climate-controlled room. Having read the words spoken and knowing how the event unfolded, I stared in silence for 5 minutes, as Sitting Bull did before he rose to speak. As my mind began to wander, it crossed time, and I began to hear the rhythmic beating on a saw blade, and then the harsh squeal of Red River carts. As I watched the parlor begin to fill with grain, I walked back out into the hot and humid North Dakota day. Carved out of time thousands of years ago, the Milk River Canyon hosts the most spectacular landscape in the Borderlands. Situated along the 49th parallel, in the southeastern corner of Alberta, the canyon was formed by diverted Laurentide glacial runoff. Today, the slow, shallow, silty Milk River meanders through a wide, flat valley for 15 to 20 miles, traversing rugged badlands before entering Montana. When I first ventured through this uncompromising country, I came to photograph its majestic beauty. During subsequent visits over the years, a tryst with the land resulted in its revelation of time. Looking out over the Badlands to where dinosaur fossils have been found can be overwhelming. It can conjure up fear, and rightfully so, for this formidable locale in the Borderlands is a desert in the making. As you navigate from the rim of the canyon, picking your way down the steep banks to the riverbed, you experience the land from a visceral perspective. Each step down is a step back in time and an acceleration of consciousness and imagination. For the most part, stillness is a characteristic of this land. It is undisturbed by human encroachment and left to ebb and flow in nature's rhythm. But this is also a place of weather extremes, where the dry wind of time lives. It bellows the heat of the summer sun and the bitter cold of the northern winter. If rain comes to this country, it comes in torrents, piercing the canyon walls, carving time out of dirt and stone. During spring runoff along the canyon floor, the meandering Milk River crests its banks to form a string of beads of oxbow lakes. In the cycle of time, they slowly vanish, evaporating in the summer heat. I did not know of William James on the summer afternoon I photographed a rainbow stretching across the Milk River Canyon in the Pinhorn Range, nor yet had I read his treatise on stream of consciousness as I shuffled my tripod along the frozen Milk River on the canyon floor a few years later. But on a warm October day, while photographing an oxbow in the canyon, with cottonwoods ablaze and the smell of sweet sage rising from the riverbanks, I stood in a Jamesian stream of consciousness, where time is the form of feeling, the form of sensibility.